One, two. Dobrý večer, good evening. This is going to be in English. My name is Tomáš Etzler. I will be moderating two incredible guests tonight. Mike Chinoy, Katharina Zellweger, both renowned world experts on North Korea. I'm very happy that both are here at the same time because they have very different experiences in North Korea and very different perspectives. Kathy Zellweger is a humanitarian worker. She is Kathy has been traveling to North Korea for over 20 years, mostly for charity work and humanitarian work to help the population there. Mike Chinoy is a journalist by training. He is a political analyst, author. So they both experienced North Korea in a different ways, and I'm very happy to have them here a little bit to kind of balance it a little bit. I will go straight into it. I will just give them the mics, and I will ask. I will start with Kathy. By the way, Kathy just arrived from North Korea. She arrived from North Korea on Sunday. She was in for 5 days, and it was their 70th visit there. Kathy, tell me a little bit first, how did you get to North Korea to start with for the first time? When was the first time you got to North Korea and how did it happen?
Well, good evening, everybody. And I'm delighted. Better? I hope so. Good evening, everybody. I'm delighted to be here and to talk to you about my experience with North Korea. It started actually in 1993. At that time, I was in Hong Kong. I worked for Caritas Hong Kong for almost 30 years. And I was attending a conference in Beijing for the United Nations, and that's where I met the first North Korean. And there were no plans that we as Caritas would be working in North Korea, but we stayed in touch. They invited me in. I said, I'm coming if there is some work for us to do. And that was in April 1995. And then in summer 1995, we have had terrible floods in North Korea, and that then started the ball rolling.
So it was the first time. Mike Chinoy, as I said, is a journalist. He was working for over 20 years for CNN. In 1985, I believe, he established a CNN office, CNN bureau in China, in Beijing, and he traveled to North Korea first time in 1989. Mike, what did you do there, and why did you go to Korea?
Hi everyone, this is my second year in a row here at Melting Pot, and it's very nice to be back despite the gloomy weather. In 1989, I was the bureau chief for CNN in Beijing, and the North Koreans were staging an international youth festival, and there were groups of young people from around the world, including a group of left-wing South Koreans. And the South Koreans decided that in order to show their disapproval of the division of Korea and their desire for a reunified Korea, they would walk across the demarcation line between the North and South in Panmunjom. And the North Koreans decided to invite a small number of Beijing-based journalists to cover this event. So they sent a special plane, which as I recall was a small Soviet-made propeller plane, and flew a handful of us to Pyongyang, and then we followed this woman on an amazing drive from Pyongyang down to the border. Through every town she went through, the North Koreans had organized massive crowds of people to wave and cheer her. And then when she got to the border, she ran across, which was illegal, and she was then arrested by the South Korean authorities and spent 3 years in jail. And after that, I was able to stay on for a week and do some additional reporting, and that was the first of my 17 trips over the last almost 25 years. More than 25 years.
We'll go back to Kathy. Tell me, I mentioned that you are a humanitarian worker. Can you tell us a little bit about the work, the content of your work you did in North Korea?
Well, in 1995, it was the first time in North Korea's history that the government asked for international assistance, and they asked the United Nations and Switzerland to come and assess the damages. And I'm Swiss, and I was on that delegation.
Excuse me, I just want to remind you that was the floods, what Kathy mentioned before, massive floods which ensued in massive famine, massive hunger. So this is, I'm just reminding you what the event was.
Right. So the floods had not only destroyed the harvest, but also the stocks. And because of that, they didn't know how to cope anymore, and they asked for international assistance. So in the early days of my work there for Caritas International, it was mostly food aid, because that's what people needed most until the harvest the following year. So all of a sudden, I was challenged with buying 10,000 tons of rice. For me, rice at that time was a packet of Uncle Ben's. I had no idea about the rice trade, but I had to learn very quickly. We would have distribution plans. We tried very hard that our aid would go to the most vulnerable, and we would follow up and visit where aid was distributed. So initially food aid, later on also medical inputs, and then into the agricultural part of it so that they could grow more food. That's the early years, especially during the famine years, and that was between 1995 up to 2000, 2001 or 2, depending on the areas, because North Korea is very, very mountainous, and they only have about 20% good arable land. So it is not easy for them to grow enough food. On top of that, it's a very harsh climate. It's very cold in winter, hot and humid in summer, and that means also a very short growing season. So we tried to help them to grow more food.
You just came back, but that was then. By the way, Katharina Zellweger has been referred to for their incredible humanitarian efforts and for bringing tens and tens of thousands of rice to help the victims of the floods, which are estimated, the records in North Korea are very unreliable, are estimated anything between 300,000 people to 3 million people died in the late 1990s because of the floods and the famine. That was then. But you just came back a couple of days ago. What do you do now in North Korea, please?
About 3 years ago, I established my own NGO. I'm still a Hong Kong resident, so Hong Kong is my home. But the NGO, the non-governmental organization, is mostly for helping people in North Korea. And what we do is we help people with disabilities. Because like in most countries all over the world, those with disabilities are So people with disability are very much of the low end of government support. So we feel very committed to help people with disabilities. It can be deaf children, blind children, people that need cataract operation, intellectually challenged children, whoever needs help. North Korea has a population of about a population of disabled people of about 6.2%, which is average around the world, but that means about 1.6 million people, and they really need assistance.
By the way, I haven't finished the thought before. Kathy, for her work in North Korea, for her decades of helping people there, has been nicknamed Mother Teresa of North Korea. Mike, have you covered that famine in North Korea, and how bad was it from your perspective?
Well, there's two separate questions. As a journalist, covering the famine was very difficult because access to North Korea is so limited. In fact, Kathy and I first got to know each other and became friends because she was one of the few people who was traveling regularly into North Korea and getting access to the areas that were most badly affected. And so she was an extremely important source in bringing word to journalists like me who could then communicate to the rest of the world. So during the 90s, I was able to go to North Korea. I went in 89, I went in 92, I went twice in 94, and then I went at least once or twice a year for the rest of the decade. During that time, we never got to see the worst hit areas, but we were able to talk to people like Kathy, and as the aid effort expanded, there were other international organizations, the World Food Program, and others who were going, and so there were people who were able to give us information and also to give us video. But from the North Koreans saw journalists like me and organizations like CNN as a way to send political and diplomatic signals to the rest of the world. And in the mid-90s, at the time that the crisis was at its height, and there was a lot of speculation outside North Korea that the whole system was going to collapse, the North Koreans used us to communicate a message that they were not going to collapse, however bad conditions were, that the system was still going to survive. And that, of course, turned out to be the case.
I want to switch the gear a little bit. Kathy, you are one of the very, very few Westerners who had a direct contact with North Koreans. Mike was there, many other journalists was there, but you know they are usually locked up in the hotels and they're just allowed to go whenever, you know, wherever they are allowed to go. Who are the North Koreans? I mean, it's such a secretive country, such a closed country to us. How would you describe, who are these people who are, I'm not talking about the politicians, I'm not talking about the NGO workers, how would you describe normal Korean people? North Korean people, that is.
You know, normal North Korean people are not much different from us. Only they live in a very different system, but they have the same dreams and aspirations. You know, like on my last trip, one of the guys I meet regularly said, "Oh, if only I could travel like you can." So they have similar dreams, and their lives is also, you know, they get married, they have children, kids go to school, they have worries about, do we have enough food? Is everybody healthy? Do we have the school materials? You know, it's very much daily life too, only surviving is much more different than our lives. They are also friendly. Once you know them, they enjoy company, and they also love singing. They have parties where they grill food and sing and dance, or you see old people in squares with an old radio and loud music, and they dance and have fun. So there is similar lives to ours, just the lifestyle is different, and they are of course much, much poorer than what we have and what we enjoy. So for me, I have become very, very grateful for having been born in Switzerland and having had such a good life.
If I could just add to that, one of the interesting things that I found, just to reinforce what Kathy said, in my trips we had a lot of dealings with fairly senior North Korean officials. And what I found was, when you talked politics, it was the party line, albeit often at a quite sophisticated level. But then you push a button, politics stops, and people have described the Koreans as the Irish of Asia. They like to drink, they are boisterous, they're passionate, and I've had, ironically, more warm and deeper dealings with quite senior North Korean officials on my trips there than, for example, I ever had in many, many years covering China, including 8 years based in Beijing as the CNN bureau chief there. So, but it's a kind of paradoxical situation. The system limits the outsider's exposure to that, but it is there, and when you get through that, it becomes, it's something that one responds to positively despite all the politics.
Mike mentioned politics. Do normal Koreans discuss politics among themselves? Do they even care about the politics, or do they have other priorities and needs?
I think there is quite a big divide between Pyongyang and the rest of the country. North Korea has about 24 million people, and 3 million live in Pyongyang. And the majority of those are more privileged people, and among them, I would think there is talk about the political situation. They also have beer halls on Friday evenings after work. They go and have a beer, and I'm sure they talk about politics, or if they have been on a trip abroad, what they have seen and experienced. In the countryside, where life is much, much tougher, I think there it's more survival. That's the first priority. They don't care that much what's happening on the political level, as long as they are sure we have enough to eat and we get by. So there is urban-rural difference, and then also Pyongyang and the rest of the country.
How open they were, you mentioned a little bit, but when you brought up, when you pushed the button, what were these buttons, and what can you openly ask them when you're talking to like a senior political officials, or party officials? Can you challenge them in interviews when you talk to them, questions? How does that work?
Well, the term interview needs to be understood. We never had interviews, or almost never had interviews where I would stick a mic and ask somebody. But I had many sort of background conversations over meals, over beers. I even had the opportunity to meet Kim Il-sung, the grandfather of the current leader, 3 separate times, including one very memorable lunch. You could ask questions in a system like that. If you go in denouncing them, the gotcha journalism that you see often in other places, that will get you nowhere in terms of a meaningful answer, and will just antagonize the North Koreans. But I found you could have a serious conversation about North Korean policy towards South Korea, towards the United States. They were less willing to talk about internal things, and so, for example, it was just pointless to try and push on internal repression or those kinds of things. The wall went down. But we had pretty interesting and often spirited exchanges trying to get a better sense, particularly of their sort of diplomatic efforts, which is what I spend a lot of time focusing on, the nuclear issue, the diplomacy behind it. And on that, I had all kinds of very interesting exchanges at quite high levels.
Now, 23 years later, after your first visit, how would you describe, what has changed in North Korea? You've been there 70 times constantly. You've been there probably pretty much every year, last 20 years.
Well, I started going in 1995, and I also lived there for 5 years, from fall 2006 to 2011. At that time, I was heading the office of the Swiss government there, so I was in a diplomatic function, so that's an additional experience to be there. And there are major changes. Most people who only go there once or twice, they can't compare what it was like, but in my case, if I look back in 1995, for example, everybody was wearing dark colors with perhaps a little bit of a white blouse, but other than that, it was olive green, dark blue, brown. Nowadays, it's much more colorful. The girls wear a little bit of jewelry, occasionally even some nail polish. So that's changed, but the major changes for me, and I call them the 5 M's. And that's easy to remember. It means money, markets, mobiles. It means motor cars, and in Pyongyang, there is a small middle class developing. More recently, I have added a 6M, and that is that especially among the younger generation, there is a different mindset. So those are the major changes I see happening and still progressing.
Wasn't it true that a few years ago just ownership of a mobile phone could end you in labor camp or in prison? That it was completely banned, mobile phones, not 10 years ago or in 2000?
They simply didn't have any.
Yeah, they didn't exist.
They didn't exist, but now we have millions of North Koreans with a mobile phone, and it's something you just have. And it's also a little bit of a status symbol, of course, especially among young people.
You know what strikes me about this is that, yes, you mentioned that these changes, and occasionally there is a news popping out of North Korea that perhaps there is a small, even like a capitalist economy developing in Pyongyang. But the narrative, especially in the global media, like a global mainstream media such as CNN, BBC, Al Jazeera, remains the same. Why? It's to me, like if you are not a North Korean expert and really follow closely, I think this narrative about a description about North Korea is the same as it was 15 years ago. Is that your impression, and why is it like that?
I think there is a kind of conventional narrative, and it's partly because most people don't think about North Korea very much, and to the extent that they do, it's been framed by this issue of North Korea having nuclear weapons and the potential threat that might pose. I also think the North Koreans don't do themselves any favors because their own propaganda and presentation, the language they use, the kind of gestures they make, is often so over the top that it lends itself to caricature, and it is also difficult for a lot of outsiders to get in and get beyond the immediate superficial impressions. But the result is that you have a narrative where it's North Korea as a nuclear threat and North Korea as a kind of comic strip caricature of itself with this so-called kooky leader and all the regimentation. I don't know if any of you ever saw the movie The Interview, the Hollywood movie. The premise is two guys go to North Korea to film an interview with Kim Jong-un, and they're hired by the CIA to assassinate him. Team America, this kind of animated thing which caricatured Kim Jong-il. And it's tricky because the reality in North Korea is much more complex and is multiple shades of gray on all of this. But it's very challenging to get that through. And in a news environment where you have headlines, the drama of the headlines is North Korea threatens to send a nuclear bomb to California, not minor changes in agricultural production techniques that could lead to a more open economy. So it's complex because the changes are slow and subtle and hard to grasp to the outside, and the other stuff is so dominant.
Besides the nuclear...
I also just wanted to add, it is extremely difficult to say anything positive about North Korea to the media, because that's not what the world wants to hear. Negative news, it's easy to place. Positive news about North Korea, you run into a wall. That's my experience.
Well, why don't you
So I'm happy to be here.
Why don't you
Perhaps
corroborate?
so
I mean,
different.
what are the positive news? I mean, what would be the positive news, that should be covered and that would actually North Korean government authorities allowed to cover?
For example, I would say the work the North Korean government does for people with disabilities. That's more than in many other Asian countries I have been to and seen. Nobody wants to report on that. So there are lots of things that are happening which you just can't report.
I think the other issue is not to paint it black and white. It's not as if it's totally negative or it's totally positive. And the job of a journalist is not to paint not to sort of take a position in a sense, but to try and the challenge is it's a very complicated place. North Korea is a real country with real people who have all kinds of real feelings, issues, and so on. It doesn't lend itself to this simple caricature. And so I think simply trying to convey a sense. I'll give you an example. The first book I wrote about North Korea was called Meltdown, the Inside Story of the North Korean Nuclear Crisis, which is a chronicle of the nuclear diplomacy from the mid-90s to the Obama administration. And I made a conscious effort in describing this to try to understand where the North Koreans were coming from, what was the logic of the positions they took in various negotiations, and what were their strategic interests. In other words, I tried to treat it like a real country with real interests, and not just the, you know, kooky evil empire out to destroy the world. And I got criticized harshly by people like John Bolton, President Trump's now national security advisor, who felt I was too soft on the North Koreans. But my response was, I'm just trying to understand them as real actors and not as caricatures. And I think just more effort to do that would make a difference.
But we witnessed it for decades that just a stick doesn't work with North Korea. They survive. I think just a stick and the threats, they strengthen the regime. Isn't it like a right?
A couple of things. First of all, the North Koreans live a very tough life, and they can take harsh conditions without cracking more than other people. And the other thing is that their response when pushed is to push back. So as somebody said, if you slap a North Korean in the face, he'll hit you on the head with a club. And if you get out a gun, he'll get out a bomb. So that's just the dynamic, and we've seen that over many years in which the efforts at sanction and coercion have been completely counterproductive. They've inflicted pain on North Korea, but they have produced no change in North Korea's behavior. So that's one of the challenges for the U.S. and other countries in dealing with North Korea is how do you try to achieve your goals in a situation where you can be as coercive as you want, but it doesn't produce the results you want?
One way or the other, North Korea is a closed country. It's very, very, close, very, very secretive. It's hard access to normal tourists, everything. Do you feel that the people in North Korea, again, you said there are two types of people, Pyongyang and our countryside, but would they like to be part of, like a more open part of global community, or is it okay for them to be kind of this kind of a pariah state, as it referred to often?
Over the many years I have been going there and working there, I'm always struck about the hunger for learning. People want to learn how we function. People want to learn how we do things. They want to see the world. And for example, before we had those very strong sanctions, more North Koreans could travel. And in 1 year, I think it's about 3 or 4 years ago, we checked with the Chinese, because when you enter China, you have to fill in a form. And we found out that over 200,000 North Koreans had traveled to China. From there, perhaps somewhere else. We couldn't figure that out. So those are people who go out, can go out, come back, bring in new information. And that taste gets on to others too, so they would like to travel too. When we organize study tours, well, we get tons of people who say, can I come too? Can I come too? But of course, it's still limited for us too, because we simply don't have the money to bring out so many people. I give you an example. About 2 years ago, we had 4 women, North Korean women in Hong Kong for 10 days. And we exposed them to all the different types of services Hong Kong has for special needs children. But they did not just see the services, they saw how Hong Kong ticks and how we live there. So every evening I thought, I wish I would be a fly on the wall and could listen what they discuss. And also I would love to hear what they tell their families and friends back home. And this is how you bring in also openings, and I think that is very important, because I believe change, sustainable change, has to come from within and cannot be imposed from the outside world.
I was just going to add, I think Kim Jong-un is a very, very interesting figure, because while he clearly is determined to hang on to power and perpetuate the Kim dynasty and the political system that exists in North Korea, he seems serious about both trying to improve the livelihood of ordinary North Koreans and also trying to give North Korea a somewhat more normal standing in the international community. And in the last few months, for example, we've seen him meet with the president of South Korea. We've seen him meet 3 times with the Chinese leader Xi Jinping. We've seen the Singapore summit with Donald Trump. So I think this is a guy who is worth watching carefully, because some of the trends that Kathy is talking about are things that I think he's not uncomfortable with seeing develop, as long as they don't undermine the fundamental sort of basis of the system. And to me, frankly, that's one of the sort of interesting contradictions. How far can they go in the kind of political system they have before international contact and exposure begins to erode it? Can they manage it? It's a dynamic the Chinese dealt with. It's a dynamic the Vietnamese dealt with. Other countries that are making this transition. The North Koreans are nowhere close to making a transition, in quotes, but it's an interesting kind of trend to watch carefully in the coming months and years.
I would also say, because of the sanctions, we are isolating them much, much more than a couple of years ago. So that's, for me, also another negative thing, because I think the more we expose them to the rest of the world, the more they would like to be part of the world.
Well, tell me, all this increased diplomatic activity you just mentioned, not just the Singapore summit, but the traveling to China, the talking to South Korea. Do they want to come out of the closet? Do you think he was educated in Switzerland? He lived in Switzerland, Kim Jong-un, meaning he must know that there is a better way of living than what they have there. I mean, do you think they want to open up but still preserve the face? Like they want to maybe bring in the sanctions, bring in foreign investment, play a bigger role than just threatening with nuclear weapons and rockets. Do you have that feeling, that this is happening?
I think with qualifications, yes. I think one of the first things Kim Jong-un said after taking power was that he did not want to ask the North Korean people to keep having to tighten their belts. And this is a guy in his early 30s. His grandfather lived to his early 80s, so in theory he could be in power for 50 years. So I think when he sits and looks at the world, do you want to spend 50 years in permanent antagonistic relationship with the U.S. over your nuclear arsenal, or do you try to do something more? So I think he's serious about improving the economy. I think he is serious about having more normal international relationships, but I also think he wants to do it while maintaining a nuclear arsenal and perpetuating the Kim dynasty. And the question over the medium term, at least in my view, is, are those two things irreconcilable, or is he going to be able to manage this very complicated balancing act? I don't know the answer, but I think he definitely wants to make some changes, but without changing the basis on which he retains power and without giving up his nuclear weapons.
What is your feel on that? Like the North Korean authorities willing to kind of become more open, bring in foreign investment and stuff like that?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, they have already established quite a number of special economic zones, and I do think they want to get rid of the sanctions, and once that is happening, step by step, probably, working through the special economic zones will be their model. And then moreover, when I went there in 1995, markets didn't exist. There were only the public distribution system, which meant non-farming people, which is about 60% of the population. They would get their food rations, mainly rice and maize and vegetable oil. And then they could shop in special shops which were subsidized, but there was no markets. And now we have probably about 500 legal markets in the whole country, and then in addition, not so unofficial as the North Koreans would call it. So that has brought in a new dynamic. And I do not think the regime can turn the clock back, also because they can't provide anymore. So if they can't provide, people find their own ways of helping themselves. And that is what's happening, and that's what I mean. Mindsets are changing because the younger generation who grew up during the famine, they are no longer used that government provides everything. They know they have to make ends meet and struggle by themselves.
One thing I want to ask you, I mean, when it comes to this kind of opening up, do you think that the North Korean authorities, maybe also the leadership, may be afraid because the atrocities they committed on their own people, over the decades are very well recorded and are well documented? And do you think there may be a fear they might be facing an international tribunal one day, for whatever crimes they committed or allegedly committed?
Well, I know they're very sensitive about that, and they reacted very strongly when there was like UN condemnation on human rights. I don't think they go around every day worrying about that. I think they've got other things to worry about. But that's one of the that's an issue that's out there in the international community, and there is a debate, I think, about does naming and shaming produce beneficial effects, or are there other ways to do it? It's a very contentious debate because there is very strong evidence of that those kind of situations do exist, and it is unquestionably a totalitarian system. But does international condemnation, other than making them angry, actually produce a change? And if not, are there other ways to do it? And one of the problems is for anyone who argues that engagement has a better chance over time of producing change, albeit very incrementally, one of the compromises you have to make, in a sense, is to sort of accept working within a system that has a lot of objectionable elements. So it's a very complicated balance. But I think if you look at Vietnam, for example, or China, although at the moment China's in this new repressive phase, but the adoption of economic reforms and led to an easier political climate in China over time, and maybe that will happen in North Korea. I don't know. The political system in North Korea is much more rigid and much more focused on the one sort of godlike ruler than in China, so it's a trickier proposition. And again, it's one of these tough issues that we don't really have any obvious clear-cut answers now.
I grew up in communism. It was a completely different communism than North Korea has. It was, by the way, you mentioned that youth, kind of a youth festival. There was a Czech band playing there. Laura Ajetikři was part of that trip of Czechoslovak communist youth delegation. And I remember growing up in communism, and I spent 7 years in China. And even young Chinese, they are proud very often that they are Chinese, but they are also very angry. They are very angry, and they have a completely much incomparably better life, especially the middle class, than in North Korea. We were angry. I was angry that I cannot travel. I was angry I cannot buy books and read books I want to. I was angry that I'm fed information I knew it's false or by communist regime. Do you feel any of that kind of not just even a realization among normal people that they are not living in a normal state, that they are not living in a normal open society? Do they have that feeling or not?
I would say there is still not enough information going into North Korea, so they are still very isolated, and I don't feel that. The other thing is, as long as, sorry, I lose my voice, obviously. The other thing is that the regime projects an enemy, so you can blame the enemy. And so it's not them, it's the enemy that makes our hardship. So it's quite well orchestrated, I would say. And as I said, as long as you struggle for survival, that's priority one. And I think for the majority of people, it's still that level.
I would add something else here, which is for within the elite who are more politically sophisticated, even if some people may privately have some of those feelings, they've watched, for example, what happened to East Germany when it collapsed and was absorbed by West Germany. And the East German elite were totally shoved aside. We both know a fellow who was an East German diplomat in Pyongyang, and after East Germany collapsed, this guy with years of expertise on North Korea was shunted aside and essentially had no job. And so when the North Koreans think about, if a North Korean were to reach the point of actually thinking, do I want to push back, see this regime go away, be absorbed by South Korea, they know that as members of the North Korean elite, they will have zero prospect of anything like the same degree of status in society. So that gives them a sense that it may not be perfect, but it's ours and we can feel good about it, and the alternatives are not very appealing. And so you talk about, are people afraid? I think people would be more afraid of a collapse that forced them to be absorbed into South Korea that wouldn't accept them than any of these other things we've been discussing.
And I also think North Koreans are very proud, proud of their country, proud of what they have achieved. The Korean War was a terrible war. North Korea, or Korea, was flattened basically, and they have rebuilt it. And children go to school, which is another achievement. So there is a certain level of education there, and proud, nationalistic, but at the same time also very emotional. That's how I would describe the North Koreans.
And what has happened in the last 6 months will have reinforced a sense of pride among people who are able to follow this, because North Korea sent officials to the Winter Olympics in South Korea. North Korea and South Korea had a summit. President of the United States had a summit with the leader of North Korea, which is something Kim Jong-un's father and grandfather desperately wanted and were unable to achieve. Things are in many ways going North Korea's way. So I think North Koreans who are at that sort of more politically conscious level probably feeling pretty good about the direction things are going now.
We mentioned a couple of times a Singapore summit. I'm sure you are aware that in Singapore a month ago, North Korean leader Kim Jong-un met with Donald Trump. First, you as somebody who is following it, what was that all about? I mean, what was it? Was there any substance to it, or was it a photo op? I mean, it was shocking that this was happening to start with. But what was it about?
Well, the North Korea one of North Korea's central policy goals ever since the early 1990s. I remember having conversation in my meetings with Kim Il-sung, where he expressed a desire to have a meeting with the American president. I, at one point, actually conveyed that message to Bill Clinton when he was president after coming back from North Korea. It never happened. A number of factors converged to make this possible. And one of the difficulties in the current situation is that the Trump administration's narrative of how this happened is different from the reality. The Trump administration's narrative is Kim Jong-un was so crushed by these sanctions and fearful of American threats that he decided he would give up his nuclear weapons and have a meeting with Trump to do that. The reality is, last year North Korea staged a successful nuclear test and a successful test of a long-range missile that could hit the United States, the continental United States, with a nuclear warhead, at which point Kim Jong-un said, okay, we now have the ability to deter the U.S., let's shift gears to diplomacy. And the South Koreans played a key role in facilitating this diplomacy, and that's partly because South Korea's president was so freaked out by Trump's threats and was worried about a war that he pushed really hard for this summit. And so when the South Koreans' envoys met the North Koreans in April, and Kim Jong-un said he was open to a summit, they conveyed this to Trump, and Trump accepted immediately without any thinking or analysis. What came out of the summit, which I think you're right, Trump saw this as a great photo opportunity to show he was a statesman, maybe he would get the Nobel Peace Prize, but the statement that came out of it might as well have been written by the North Koreans, because Trump gave up an enormous amount and got very little out of it. The language used was North Korean terms of reference. North Korea made no concrete concessions, and I think the North Koreans have figured out if they give Trump his PR moment, that he's not really going to push them. So, in my view, it was a huge triumph for Kim Jong-un, and we've seen since then that while Trump keeps talking about what a great success this was and North Korea is going to give up its nukes, in fact, the North Koreans have done nothing, and so far the the Trump administration continues to pretend that they have, and I think North Korea feels as long as that's the dynamic, they'll just continue to quietly develop their nuclear capability while basking in the warmth of Donald Trump's friendly vibes until that might change, which it might or it might not, we don't know.
Do North Koreans even know that this event happened? I mean, and do they care? Do they know who Donald Trump is? The normal population of North Korea. What is your feeling on that? You know,
As far as I know, the summit was on television, not at the time the summit was happening, but a couple of days later. That's very often the case. So yes, they do know this happened. They also know that in the meantime, Kim Jong-un has met several times with Xi Jinping in China, has met several times with President Moon from South Korea. So they do know things have somewhat changed. To what degree, I think that's a bit of tea leaf reading for all of us, because we don't really know what direction we go, but there is a change in the air, I would think.
what is the perception of the United States among normal North Koreans? We know, I mean, like a regular, regular population. I tell you why I'm asking this question. We know what the official rhetoric is. We know what the official narrative is. You know, I also spent a lot of time in Middle East in early 2000s, you know, before the Second Gulf War in 2003 and after the Second Gulf War. And of course, everybody talks about how they hate America, how they hate Bush, the President Bush then, but then you go out and everybody listens to Eminem, everybody wears American sneakers, everybody wears Levi's jeans, you know, everybody listens to, watches American movies. How is that perception of America in North Korea?
That's not quite the case, and you don't see blue jeans in North Korea. That's basically a no-go. But people, you know, as I said, they know what's happening, but that's about it. More, not necessarily. But I would also say there is this picture of an enemy. So before the summit, we had all these posters in Pyongyang, you know, very much anti-American posters. When I was there last week, they had all gone, they had all disappeared. Or I give you another example. I once had Americans in delegations visiting North Korea, and I introduced my delegation members and I said, this gentleman is from the US. And the lady we were meeting, they shook hands, and she had tears in her eyes and said, never in all my life did I think I would shake hands with an American. So these people-to-people interactions can make a huge change on how people see other countries, other people.
Do you think that summit can change anything? I mean, or was it really, you know, like you said, there was no concession from the North Koreans. There was just, there was not even talk about the ending of the, you know, because both Koreas, North and South Korea, are still technically at war. There was absolutely nothing of the substance, but can it lead to something?
Well, I think what it has led to already is a major North Korean diplomatic victory. The reality is that North Korea has successfully made itself into a nuclear weapons state, and for the time being at least, whatever he says about North Korea's supposed willingness to denuclearize, whatever you hear from Trump, Trump has in effect legitimized the North Korean leader at the highest level while North Korea possesses nuclear weapons. So I think what the summit did was to give this enormous diplomatic victory to North Korea. I think there is a legitimate question to be asked about the longer term, in the sense that if you believe that sanctions were never going to force a change in North Korean behavior and going to war was an unacceptable option, and if, which I think is true, North Korea's long-term goal has always been a fundamental change in the nature of its political relationship with the United States to turn it from an enemy into a more normal relationship, then it's possible that the steps that may be unfolding from the summit onwards of a less strained U.S.-North Korea relationship might over time create a situation where North Korea felt sufficiently secure to begin to roll back its nuclear program. But I'm not sure that's true, and with somebody as erratic and mercurial and emotional and ignorant as Donald Trump as America's president, I'm not sure that what you're seeing from Washington is a strategy that is even remotely as sophisticated as the idea I've just laid out to you. But they are talking, which is better than shooting at each other, and we just don't know whether that's going to lead to something substantive over time, or whether one day Donald Trump is going to wake up, decide that he's been tricked by North Korea, and revert back to the threats, and we're back to the situation we had last year. My guess is that people like John Bolton would like to see that and are hoping that happens. I just don't know.
But I would also say another point is that I feel now South Korea is much more involved. South Korea is also in the driving seat, and that makes a huge difference, because at the end of the day, it is an issue between North and South Korea. The US is far away, and South Korea will have to probably carry a very heavy burden. South Korea has double the number of people, about 50 million, North Korea 25 million. So I always say South Korean is 2 to 1. So it's a different ball game than East-West Germany, for example.
I think one other point to bear in mind is that if Trump suddenly decides he doesn't like where this is going, because in fact Kim Jong-un is not giving up his nuclear weapons, it's going to be very hard for the U.S. to recreate the international coalition that was bringing pressure to bear on North Korea last year, because the Chinese, the Russians, and the South Koreans in this current climate are eager to ease sanctions, are not going to want to go back to confrontation, and so it's going to be, the U.S. will really have to go it alone if it sought a more confrontational policy. Which is why, in the end, I think the bottom line is Kim Jong-un and North Korea gets away with making itself a nuclear power, and the world, however uncomfortably, is going to end up having to live with that.
We don't have much time left. I want to ask if there is any question from the audience, if anybody wants to ask anything regarding this.
Somebody right there. Right?
Yes. They're bringing you a microphone.
Hello. I only want to ask why North Korea cannot have nuclear weapons. Why cannot have nuclear weapons?
Well, they have nuclear weapons, so but I think it's a very complicated issue, partly because I think there's a consensus among many in the international community that the more countries that have nuclear weapons, the greater the danger they'll be used. There is a whole international non-proliferation regime, and there's the non-proliferation treaty, which is designed to constrain countries from developing nuclear weapons. And so when a country like North Korea is able to effectively circumvent that and turn itself into a nuclear power and get away with it, the lesson to lots of other countries who might have similar aspirations is we too can have nukes. It's bad enough that you have 8 or 9 countries that are nuclear powers, but if lots of other countries think that's the ticket to security, legitimization from the United States, go build your own bomb, then you get a nuclear arms race in an extremely unstable and dangerous world. So I think part of the concern over many years about North Korea is not just the specifics of North Korea, although that's serious enough given the history of conflict between North and South and between North and U.S., but the blow that it represents to international efforts to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons. And there are plenty of other countries who are going to read precisely that lesson into what North Korea did. We can do it, nobody can stop it, we can get away with it, and in the end, the Americans will accept it just like they did with Pakistan, just like they did with India. And so the upshot is you could go from a handful to a larger number of countries with nukes, and not all countries have responsible political leaderships, and not all countries can control proliferation of fissile material or nuclear technology. And the upshot is the likelihood that a nuclear weapon will be used at some point increases, and that should scare everybody.
You know, I will ask you one of the last questions. After 23 years of traveling to North Korea frequently, is there anything that still surprises you, or do you still, is there something that it was like, wow, I did not know that?
Good question. Let me say, on every trip there are surprises, and sometimes I describe North Korea like a puzzle, and you fit in pieces and then others fall off. So there are always surprises. I give you one example. I was in a minor town, I would say, and we were waiting to drive off, and in the town square, very public, there was a table, people around the table, and a piece of paper with lots of numbers, and I couldn't figure out what those numbers were and what they were doing. So I asked my guardian angel and said, "What are they doing over there?" And he looked at me like it was the most common thing to say. He said, "Lottery, of course." Lottery? Lottery, North Korea, okay. So on every trip there's something where I say, okay, I've learned something. So it's a continuous learning process for me, and probably also for the North Koreans dealing with me.
How about you, North Korean politics, Kim Jong-un? Is there anything that surprises you, who've been traveling there for 3 decades now?
Well, I think the notion of trying to figure out North Korea is like a giant puzzle, and you get different pieces, and you know, those of us who've been a lot have some more pieces than those who haven't been at all, but nobody has all the pieces, and so you're always looking to fill in the gaps. I think, to me, I don't know how surprising it is, but I think the direction that Kim Jong-un wants to take the country now is a significant departure from what we've seen previously, and bears very careful watching, and might well lead to some surprising things in ways that challenge the conventional stereotype about North Korea as this completely regimented society of zombies and automatons, when in fact it's already not like that, and frankly never was. But he may open the door to some things that will surprise us as he tries to modernize the country and implement some changes.
I will give another chance. Is anybody else wants to ask anything?
Hello. You said that Kim Jong-un is well educated and have education in Switzerland. Do you think that he's powerful enough to make these changes? I mean, that another elite can say, okay, you open our country too much and we don't want you and we will kill you, or something like that?
Well, it's impossible to predict. It's worth noting that a lot of people didn't think that Kim Jong-un would survive after his father died in late 2011, but he has managed not only to survive, but to eliminate key rivals. He's shown himself to be extremely ruthless. He executed his uncle. He had his half-brother killed. There's a famous photograph of Kim and all of the people walking in the funeral procession for his father, or these aged generals. Almost all of them have been removed. And he's begun to put in younger people who are sort of a new generation. So he has seemed to be a combination of skill and ruthlessness to have consolidated his power. On the other hand, in South Korea, Park Chung-hee, the military dictator from the mid-1950s to the early 1970s, was assassinated by his own national security advisor. So who knows? I mean, we don't know enough about the internal workings. It's not impossible, but so far he's been pretty skillful at sidelining potential threats, consolidating his power, and now he's got a very impressive set of victories that he can tout to anybody who might remain doubtful. He's achieved this nuclear deterrence, he's gotten legitimacy from the Chinese, the South Koreans, and finally an American president. He looks like he's going to be able to push, sanctions are going to begin to erode. So what's not to like? And people also know if you cross him, you're dead.
Personally, I think we always just speak about Kim Jong-un, but from my perspective, it's Kim Jong-un as the figurehead of the family, and then it's the party and the military. And these three have to get on with each other in order to survive. And you see sometimes how all of a sudden the party becomes stronger on certain issues. So I just don't think it's only Kim Jong-un. For regime survival, he needs the people around him, and the people around him need him.
I thank you very much. Unfortunately, we ran out of time. I really want to thank you very much, Katharina, and thank you very much, Mike, to this very rare inside view of the country most of us will never be able to go. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you.